Welcome to this explainer. Today we're cutting straight through the Hollywood fog, tossing out the top hats and looking directly into the gritty, factual reality behind history's most infamous unsolved mystery, Jack the Ripper. Section 1. The Dark Heart of London, Whitechapel in 1888.
To really understand these crimes, we first have to understand the absolute pressure cooker they happened in. Late Victorian London, it was a city of extreme, incredibly dark contrasts. On one side, you had the West End, just this affluent, glittering capital of the British Empire. But just a few miles east lay Whitechapel. It was essentially a sprawling, dark mirror to all that prosperity. Think of a maze of alleys, thick with coal smoke, where 80,000 people were literally crammed into a single square mile of decaying tenements.
And for the most destitute women living in this district, survival was quantified by one very specific amount: 4p. That was the nightly cost of a crowded, completely flea-ridden bed in a local doss house. If you couldn't scrape that together, well, you were out on the freezing streets. This brutal reality forced vulnerable women into casual sex work just to secure a warm meal, effectively isolating them in the very shadows where violence was, sadly, an everyday reality.
Section 2. The Canonical Five, a Chronicle of Slaughter.
All right, let's look at the specific victims of that terrifying autumn. Now, while there were definitely other murders, criminal historians zero in on the Canonical Five because they show a highly specific, escalating pattern. It kicked off on August 31st with Mary Ann Nichols. Exactly a week later, Annie Chapman was killed, and this is where the perpetrator actually began removing internal organs. Then came September 30th, the horrifying double event where both Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were murdered in one night. And finally, on November 9th, the unparalleled carnage of Mary Jane Kelly. It was just this escalating frenzy that suddenly, inexplicably, stopped.
Section 3. Birth of the Myth, Dear Boss and the Media Frenzy. So how exactly did a nameless killer transform into the legendary ghost we talk about today? Well, the answer actually lies in the mail. The two most famous communications we have, the Dear Boss letter, which, by the way, officially coined the name Jack the Ripper, and the Saucy Jackie postcard, they were incredibly theatrical. Modern historians strongly suspect these were just opportunistic hoaxes cooked up by journalists. Why? Well, to keep public panic at an absolute fever pitch and sell more newspapers right at the dawn of mass media.
But then, right in the middle of October, a man named George Lusk received a letter titled, From Hell. The spelling was atrocious, completely lacking any of that theatrical journalistic flair we just talked about. And most disturbingly, it was packaged with half of a human kidney. Medical exams actually show that the kidney came from someone suffering from Bright's disease, which, chillingly, was a condition victim Catherine Eddowes had. So this particular letter carries immense weight, as quite possibly the only genuine communication from the actual killer.
Section 4. Suspects and Flawed Forensics, the Victorian Hunt.
With panic absolutely sweeping the city, you might be wondering, why on earth couldn't the largest police investigation in Victorian history catch this guy? Simply put, investigators were working in the dark. I mean, we take forensics completely for granted today, right? But back in 1888, fingerprinting was still a decade away, blood typing was totally unknown, detectives literally couldn't even tell human blood from animal blood on a butcher's apron. Add in terrible crime scene preservation where huge crowds just trampled all over the evidence, and the police basically had to rely on foot patrols and, well, wildly unreliable bloodhounds.
Even with that massive lack of science, the police definitely had their prime suspects. First, you had Aaron Kosminski, a local barber dealing with intense delusions, who was actually named outright in the memoirs of senior police officials. Then there was Montague J. Druitt, an educated barrister who was found drowned in the Thames right after the final murder, which of course sparked huge rumors of a guilt-driven suicide. And then we have Francis Tumblety, just this eccentric quack doctor and extreme misogynist who was arrested for indecency and pretty much immediately fled to New York on bail.
Now, of course, the speculation absolutely did not stop in the 19th century. Modern authors love throwing out these wild, historically baseless theories just to sell books. I mean, they've accused everyone from the famous painter Walter Sickert to literally Prince Albert Victor of the royal family. But honestly, these elaborate conspiracies completely ignore historical reality. For instance, official records absolutely prove the prince was hundreds of miles away in Scotland and Germany when the murders happened.
Section 5. The Modern DNA Illusion, Science versus Myth.
So, has modern technology finally managed to solve this massive cold case? Well, in 2014, some researchers actually attempted to do just that.
They got their hands on an unwashed silk shawl that was allegedly taken from Catherine Etowah's crime scene. From there, they extracted mitochondrial DNA from stains on the fabric and compared it to living descendants of both Etowahs and our prime suspect, Aaron Kosminski. And this led to massive, worldwide headlines loudly claiming that Jack the Ripper had definitively been caught.
But we have to ask ourselves, was the case truly closed? Did modern science actually manage to catch a Victorian ghost? Or was this whole thing just driven by our very modern, very desperate need for a neat and tidy conclusion?
Yeah, unfortunately, it was mostly just a desperate need for a conclusion. The scientific community swooped in and quickly dismantled the findings. First off, the chain of custody is utterly shattered. There is literally zero official police record of that shawl ever even existing at the crime scene. On top of that, the fabric survived over a century of extreme contamination, basically being passed around barehanded by private owners. But here's the real kicker. Mitochondrial DNA only proves a shared maternal line, not individual identity. Literally, millions of people share it. Add in some pretty glaring mathematical errors in their rarity calculations, and the so-called definitive proof just completely falls apart.
Section 6. Remembering the victims, the true cost of the dark heart. As we wrap things up today, let's pull the lens all the way back out. Let's move away from the monster for a second and actually look at the tragic human cost here. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Etowahs, Mary Jane Kelly. These 5 women were not just props in some gothic horror story. They were real mothers, sisters, and daughters who laughed, who suffered, and who fought to survive. They were ground down by a totally unforgiving society that offered them absolutely no protection.
Which really brings us to a final, haunting question. Why does society continually choose to immortalize the monster rather than remember the desperate humanity of the women whose lives he stole? As we close out this explainer, I really want to leave you with that thought. Because the shadow of the killer continues to eclipse his victims. And honestly, that reveals just as much about our collective memory today as it does about those dark alleys back in 1888.
Please like and subscribe.